to everyone, kickstart everyone off. I'm Vicky, I'm a GP task force change facilitator. Ross has very kindly, this is his 4th training session that he's done for us. And we're going to miss you when you've gone, Ross.
I'm sure you'll find something else for me to do.
Oh, I will. So yeah, today's a bit more advanced, joining reports together and looking at things a bit more complex. But I'll hand you across to Ross. But if anyone has any questions, just feel free to give me a quick email. I'll pop my email address in the chat box for you.
So today, as Vicky says, we're going to look at what we call advanced population reporting in EMIS. I mean, advanced can sometimes sound a little bit intimidating. What we mean by that is just going to look at some of the cleverer bits beyond the simple search for, you know, a clinical criteria. We're going to go a bit beyond the show me everyone that had tonsillitis or show me everyone in the practice on warfarin. And we're going to try and make them a little bit more specific and, you know, try and get a little bit cleverer with what we return and look at a couple of the questions that we don't get asked very often, but we do get asked from time to time. So a couple of housekeeping bits first. Those of you that have met me before, I'm sure probably 2/3 on the call have met me in some capacity. I'm Ross, I'm one of the clinical systems specialists at NECS. So as we've established, we do System 1 and EMIS, and we cover the whole of Derbyshire, the GPIT at least. Any questions, as Vicky says, if they're sort of about the webinar, if they're about how these run, that kind of thing, you can email Vicky. She's put us in the chat. Obviously, very busy lady at the moment, very in demand with the vaccination program, etc. Similarly, you're welcome to email me. Similar kind of situation, unfortunately, at the minute. I'm in about 15 places at the same time. But you can also use the NECS IT help desk. There's one of us as the clinical system specialists on there every day. Hopefully on all of your machines you'll have the help desk number on your desktop background, and you can direct clinical systems queries through that channel as well. You can ring up and just say to the help desk, I'm having a bit of trouble building a report in EMIS. Can you get one of the trainers to give me a ring and have a look with me? And we're normally pretty happy to do that, especially if it's me, because as I've said, I quite enjoy my reporting. I'm a little bit sad, but you know, that's what they pay me for. So what are we going to do today? A bit of advanced EMIS reporting. Obviously, we're doing it virtually. So we've set microphones and webcams off for the most part, more so because we tend to get feedback on some of the microphones if your speakers are a bit too close to it. And webcams, if you want to put your webcam on, you know, I'm quite happy to see you all, but it does tend to slow things down a bit. So if you find that yours is stuttering, etc., it's normally a good idea in these kind of things to turn your webcam off. Just a general tip with these, really. We're going to use the chat for any questions, if that's okay. Main reason for that being, it means I can keep my train of thought going. So if somebody stops me and asks me verbally, it tends to throw off my train of thought, whereas if it's in the chat, I can get to the end of the point and then go back to it. So if you do stick a question in the chat and I don't answer it straight away, I'm definitely not ignoring you. I'm just a fairly simple man, and if I try and answer 2 things at once, my head might catch fire. And we're going to run for about 90 minutes today, give or take, depending on questions we get and as much as anything, how quickly my demo unit responds to me. But we'll aim for about the 90 minutes with some time at the end just to have some questions. And when I say questions, we can be fairly creative with those. You are welcome to chuck sort of scenarios at me or things that you've maybe tried to return when you've been doing reporting. Just bear in mind that it's a demo unit, so the results it returns might be complete and total rubbish. And similarly, I'm a clinical systems specialist, not a clinician. So some of the things that I run might be clinically complete and utter rubbish. So bear with me, they're just examples for the purposes of showing you how something works. I'm not saying that you'll ever run what I run in general practice. Okay, so what are we going to do today? As we've said, when we say advanced reporting, we basically mean the more complex stuff than a simple clinical query. For example, how many patients have I got at my practice on warfarin? We're going to get a bit cleverer. We're going to use the count function. So looking at things, you know, how many patients DNA'd more than 3 times in a particular period? How many patients are on more than 6 repeats? That kind of thing. We're going to have a look at the order, restrict and check function tools when we add features in EMIS reports. So we're basically being a bit more specific about the codes that we use. We might say, for example, show me everyone with this code, but make sure that's the last code on their record from this particular group. We're going to have a look at the example of smoking, because obviously, you know, if someone was a smoker and is now an ex-smoker, they're going to have both of those codes on their record, but we're only interested in the latest one. We're going to have a quick recap on auto reports around the same time. You'll see why when I get to it, but it's quite a useful little example of how you can make quick changes to auto reports to make them particularly useful. We're going to have a look at something called linked features. It's a really clever little piece of the reporting functionality in EMIS Web. It's one that I always get my tongue wrapped a little bit around when I try and explain it, so you might have to bear with me a little bit when I go into it. And we're going to have a look at something called is not as a function. It's a strange concept, but I've got a decent example from a practice that might start to apply to everyone at some point. So we're going to explore that one. And last but not least, we'll have a look at scheduling reports. So basically how you can make them run on relative dates, how you can, you know, roll them forward on the schedule, that kind of thing. And as I say, then at the end, we'll have a bit of time just to have any questions. We can just have a bit of a play, basically. You can chuck stuff at me and we can see if we can answer it. See if we can come up with some ideas for how to do particular things. Okay, so as I say, I'll keep an eye on the chat. If I do look like I've missed you, profuse apologies. I will come back around, and every now and then I'll just duck into the chat and make sure I haven't missed anything. So if you see my screen flash around a little bit, it's probably because I opened the chat box on Zoom. Okay, so without further ado, let's hop into EMIS Web. And you can see here I've gone straight in at the population reporting screen. Just to recap from last time, EMIS bubble, reporting, population reporting. If that doesn't show up for you, it's probably because you haven't got the rights on your card to do it, at which point you'll be having a chat with our friends in the RA, just to get those added. So, we're not going to go too far back over the basics from last time. As we've said, there's a recorded version floating about that we'll be able to have a look at. But instead, we're going to dive straight in at the deep end, and we're going to have a look at that count function in EMIS Web. I'll check before I move on that the screen it's sharing is actually the right one. Just make sure. Before we go any further, I'll put the chat back up just so I can keep an eye open in case anyone does need to get hold of me. Okay. So, the count function in EMIS Web. What we're going to do, because we've got a folder already, my training, we're going to add a subfolder just to keep it nice and neat. And we're going to call this GPTF Advanced because that's what we're doing today. Normally when you're building these, obviously name them for the kind of reports that are in there. This is going to be a bit of a mishmash because we're going to fly around a few examples today. The first one we're going to build is a report to have a look at how many patients have DNA'd in the past year. But we're not interested if someone's just DNA'd once, you know, the car broke down or something and they haven't made it. Instead, we're interested in patients that frequently DNA. So I'm going to have a look for all my patients that have DNA'd more than 3 times in the last year. And to do that, we're going to use the count function in EMIS Web Reporting. So I'm going to add a new patient search because I want to return actual patient details. I'm going to call it more than 3 DNAs last 12 months because there's no such thing as too much information in a title. Although I could put some of it in the description, but I'm not going to because that says it all. We're going to base our search on our currently registered patients. Again, if the patient left our practice 6 months ago, I don't really need to know if they frequently DNA'd because they're no longer my problem, with the greatest of respect. And we're not going to base our report on the population of another search because we're looking at all of our practice patients. So we created our search. We're going to have to put some rules on there so EMIS knows what to look for. We're going to create a new rule, and the feature that we're going to look for, in this case, we're going to look at appointments. Now you'll see different people do this different ways. there's every chance you might end up including both to try and capture everyone. Some practices will run it on the DNA read codes, or SNOMED codes, I should say. Did not attend, no reason, did not attend, reason given, that kind of thing. But I'm going to run it on appointment because I know that this will work in my demo unit, basically. I'm going to set that my features appointment date has to be after a year before today. Horrible grammar, but EMIS Web does kind of give you an idea of what it's looking at down here, and it translates it into plain English here. So we had a look at that last time. The date ranges and the way that EMIS phrases it, you get a lot of double negative kind of phrasing in there, but we can get around it. So I want patients with appointments after a year ago, i.e. in the last year, and my appointment status, we're going to look for patients that are either still in booked, i.e. nobody's arrived them, sent them in, marked them as left, marked them as finished, etc. And obviously we're going to look for those that were actually marked as DNA. So well and good so far. It's going to find me every patient with an appointment in the last year that was either left as booked or DNA'd. In other words, it wasn't marked as seen, finished, sent in, etc. But like we said, that's going to get us everybody that's DNA'd, even if it was just a one-off and they rang up and apologised profusely afterwards. We want our frequent DNAs. So we're going to apply a count, and to do that, we need to highlight the thing that we want to count. So we want to count patients with appointments. We click on count up in the top, little controls up here, and the count in this case is going to be more than 3. We can actually do a count between, you know, an upper and a lower maximum, but in this case we don't need to. In this case, a count of above 3 is good enough for us to have a chat with them and say, well, you need to pull your socks up a little bit. And you can see there it's changed my feature to include patients with more than 3. If I remove that count, we can see it doesn't let us once we've applied it. It's getting more than 0. Doesn't like it. Fair enough, once we've applied it, we'd have to cancel and rebuild the feature. But we don't need to, that's good enough. So we've got patients with monthly appointments, appointment date in the last year, current status either booked or DNA, in other words, they haven't been marked as sent in. If they meet those criteria, we want them to be included in my final result. And we looked at that last week, we can toggle these. So we can say, show me everyone that didn't DNA 3 times if we ever needed to, by toggling these to the opposite way around. We don't need to add any more rules because we're not getting any more complex than that at the moment. So we're going to save and run up at the top of the screen. It's going to think about it for a couple of seconds, hopefully only a couple. It's going to ask me to run this report. I'm not going to look at the advanced options for now, but we are going to touch on them later on. And it's returned there 7 patients with more than 3 DNAs in the last 12 months from my search date. As we established last week, from here we could select that. We could see our included population down here at the bottom. So all of those patients have DNA'd more than 3 times. We could see everyone that's not included. We're going to throw these in a few times today because basically it seems like a good opportunity to get you guys used to how they work. We might want to know how many times each of those patients have DNA'd. One of them might only have DNA'd 4 times, because it's greater than 3. One of them might have DNA'd 20 times. So I'm going to highlight the search that I've built, and I'm going to run an auto report from up here at the top. And it's going to add the auto report as a little sub report. When it's thought about it, we see there, changes the icon from a population search to an auto report, and we're going to view the results. You can see there, it shows us page by page, page 1 of 7 down here, how many times they've DNA'd, what dates they've DNA'd on, that kind of thing. We might want to change that. So if I close my auto report, highlight it and edit it, instead of seeing all of the different dates that my patient DNA'd on, I might instead want to lose the appointment date, lose the current slot status, and instead I might want to have a fairly simple count of the number of times they've DNA'd. Now when I view the results of my auto report, instead of showing me a list of dates, it's just showing me the count. He's been busy. 50 DNAs in a year, I think we might have him off the list. How do you sort the date without letters? Ah, okay. So that's a good question. We've got one from Tracy in the chat. How do we sort the date without letters? Do you mean the abbreviated month here? Let's close out of that and edit our auto report. So where we go with, let's change the date of birth. As an example. That's a really good question, actually. Trying to think if there's a way to get it to do DDM or MYY instead of abbreviated month. I know what you're saying. Leave that one with me. I can't think of a way off the top of my head, but I'll have a look for you. We'll keep that one for the end and we'll have a play. Okay. So count, fairly simple feature, but it's quite a useful one. Might want to use it in, so if we're looking for patients of more than a with more than a particular number of repeats, for example, or more than a particular number of a procedure, or more than a particular number, blood test taken, that kind of thing. The next thing we're going to look at is the order function in EMIS Web. And for this one, we're basically going to try and establish the last example of a particular group of codes. I'm going to try that with smoking. So if I do a patient search for current smokers, logically that's going to be my current population. And my rule, I'm going to be looking for a read code as my feature this time. Clinical codes, that code being smoker codes. I'm going to go up one from current smoker. I'm going to include all the tobacco smoking behaviour codes for now. So I'll make sure that I get all of them. So far, we're saying, show me all of my patients with a tobacco smoking behaviour code on their record. But if my patient 5 years ago was a current smoker and is now an ex-smoker, they're still going to have that current smoker code on their record because 5 years ago it was correct. It was an accurate finding, it's an accurate observation. What we're going to do is we're going to order, restrict, or perform checks on the resulting clinical codes. And what that basically means is we're going to make it a little bit more specific. We're going to tell you exactly which example of the code on the record we're interested in seeing. This time, we're interested in date. So we only want to know the latest smoking code on the patient's record. And we're going to make sure, we're going to check that that code falls into the smoker code. So what we're basically saying is, show me all of the codes on their record that corresponds to tobacco smoking, but make sure that the latest falls under smoker, not ex-smoker, not never smoked tobacco. I'm going to save them up, as we always do. And that's going to show me all of my current smokers. So test patient population, we tend to make a lot of them smokers because it's quite a useful criteria to then report on. And again, just to show you the functionality, if we wanted to use my auto report, we might want to see, well, you know, what code's got them on there. So you can see there we're using a mix of current smoker, light smoker, moderate smoker, cigarette smoker, etc., etc. But it's picking up all the patients where the latest code on their record is one of the smoker codes. So when you run an auto report with a condition like we've just done, with a check on the code, looking at the latest one, we should only see a patient match once. So obviously it's looking at the latest example of those codes on their record. Slightly different way we could have gone about that would be something called a linked feature in EMIS Web. Now, linked features are a bit of a complex concept, so bear with me a little bit on this one. We're going to do this a couple of times. I'm going to play with a couple of examples just because they do repay a bit of extra explanation. So the first one I'm going to do is current smoker. Same sort of thing as before. We're going to be looking for a clinical code, where that clinical code comes from the smoker hierarchy. And we'll go for the whole of tobacco smoking. So again, nice and broad. Okay. So far that's going to find us anybody that's got a smoker code. We're going to do the same as we did last time. We're going to order, restrict, or perform checks. We're going to look for the latest one. But this time, we're going to use the linked feature up here at the top of the screen. Because what we're going to look at this time is that the latest code on their record is a tobacco smoker code, but we're going to make sure that that does not include the codes ex-smoker, ex-smoker, any of the ones basically where they're not currently smoking. So what we're going to do with the link feature, the date is going to be equal to or after our smoker code. So we're going to say it's got to be at least, let's say, 1 day after the code that we're looking for, the tobacco smoking. So what we've said so far, find me patients with a tobacco smoking code, only show me the latest example of that, but then check for codes where the date is after this code, and our criteria here is going to be ex-smoker. See there we've got all the variations of ex-smoker. Now at the moment, that's not really much good to us. It's saying, show me all patients with a clinical code tobacco smoking behaviour. Look at the latest example of that. Then we use a link feature to make sure that there wasn't a subsequent code, one entered up after 1 day after this code, basically any time from the day after this code was added, of ex-smoker. So we're not had one recorded that they quit. But we don't want those ex-smokers to be included in our search. And you can see there at the moment, our linked feature is also including clinical codes. So we're going to click on that. We're going to use the controls up here at the top instead to exclude any codes entered after, sorry, we're going to exclude patients with a code entered after our tobacco smoking behaviour, where that code is ex-smoker or one of its children. Don't worry, I'm going to do another example of this one in a second. We save and run. And basically this will just return for me patients with a tobacco smoking code that don't have a subsequent ex-smoker code. So it's another take on the one that we did previously. Where it's finding me everyone with a tobacco smoker code. Well, it doesn't look like it's gone quite right actually, so bear with me. Okay, so the last, yeah, it's a discrepancy in the way our data is recorded on the unit. We're going to do another example anyway. Basically tends to be with these kind of units that the patient information doesn't get maintained in that kind of, sensible sequence of smoker, ex-smoker, that kind of thing. So we're going to add another search. We're going to do another patient search. We're going to do the classic one, asthma not resolved. Based on our current population, looking at patients with the clinical code asthma or any of its children. So we're looking for anybody with an asthma diagnosis. We're then going to perform a check on our code and make sure that the one we're looking at is the latest. We're going to look at our linked feature. This time it's going to be a clinical code with a date. Again, we're looking at after. So our asthma, we're going to look at the asthma resolved code, and it's got to have come after our asthma diagnosis. We're going to include the code asthma resolved. And what we see so far, again, is that this search at the moment is going to include patients with asthma, looking at the latest code that they have from that family. But then it's only going to show us patients that have subsequently been recorded as asthma resolved, because we're including clinical codes with the date after our asthma diagnosis, where that code is asthma resolved. We don't really want that. We want to include our asthma patients, but then we want to exclude the ones that have a subsequent resolved code. So again, we're going to highlight our linked feature, and we're going to change our control up here to exclude patients coded after their asthma diagnosis as asthma having resolved. And click OK. Let's save and run that. And this should only return me patients with a current asthma diagnosis without a subsequent asthma resolved diagnosis. And just for the purposes of proving the concept here, let's have a quick search just for patients with asthma resolved. Because then I'll be able to show you what EMIS Web has done in the background. So we'll do a quick search for patients with the asthma resolved code. Bound to have a few on here. So we've got 43 patients. Let's pick on the top one. Irene Abbott, she'll do nicely. I go on my asthma not resolved. She doesn't appear in my population included. She does appear near the top of my population excluded. And remember, when we're looking at a report, we can right click on a patient and check them. And we can see here that Irene's asthma code, her diagnosis was backdated to 1965, but her asthma resolved was recorded in 2014, which is why she's been excluded from our population, because her asthma has subsequently resolved. So that's a couple of examples of the linked feature in EMIS Web. Basically, what you do is you define the thing you're looking for. You will typically want to order by date and select the latest. So you'll perform that check on the codes. You will then use the linked feature to exclude another criteria. For example, in this case, the asthma resolve code. Typically, in that kind of example, you're going to be looking at codes or medication or whatever, where the date is more than or equal to a day after the initial code that you were looking for. And you can see there, what we then have to do is tell EMIS that instead of including people with those codes, instead we want to exclude them. So we don't want to see people that return our resolved or our, the one that we want to leave out. We need to make sure that we change that to exclude them. Okay. Hoping that makes sense. It's one that I will be happy to have another look at the end if anyone wants to, if anyone's got a particular example, which it does take a little bit of getting used to when you first start running these, using the linked feature bit, even down to the point, which bit of the feature do you link? So if anyone does have any examples towards the end, quite happy to have a look at those with you. Okay, so the next thing we're going to have a look at now is the is not function. And this is a bit of a bizarre concept, really. It doesn't get used very often, but thankfully we've got a ready-made example. I'm sure you've all heard all about e-repeat dispensing. Not kind of e-repeat dispensing, electronic repeat dispensing, and the fact that it is not particularly easy to manage if your patient is on medication that varies wildly during the course of a year. It tends to work for people that go on something and stay on it in the same dose at the same frequency for the whole of the year. So one of the things we got asked basically was, how do I find patients that are just on thyroxine? Because they were identified as quite a good cohort to start us with. But question gets a little bit more complex, and we say, okay, who's on thyroxine? Well, who's only on thyroxine? Who isn't on any other repeat medication? Because if they're on, let's say they're on something like, I don't know, mirtazapine, well, that's going to throw things all over the place when we're trying to electronically repeat dispense their thyroxine. So we might want to exclude those patients and manage them separately. Let's go in and build it. What we're going to do is a new patient search. Patients only on repeat levothyroxine. Still using our current practice population. We're not going to include anyone that's passed away or left, because we're definitely not going to be repeat dispensing for them. First part is fairly straightforward. The first thing we're going to do is create a rule to look for patients on thyroxine. It's going to be a new feature. It's a medication, and because we're looking at patients on repeat thyroxine, we're looking at medication courses. If we're looking at patients that had it acutely, we'd be looking at medication issues. Remember that from a couple of weeks ago. The two are very different. We're going to look for the drug. we're going to search for levothyroxine. Remember to use your little controls just under here, because we're looking for the ingredient, not the action group. And for the purposes of finding some patients, I'm going to throw in both thyroxine and levothyroxine sodium, just to make sure I get some matches. Obviously, in the real world, you'd be a little bit more careful with the drugs that you're selecting. I'll say okay. So far, so good. We're going to add another criteria and say that that repeat template has to be current. So we're going to look at course status and just include those who are currently on the drug. And that's all well and good. That gives us all of our patients on repeat levothyroxine currently. But we've said that we don't want patients if they have any other repeat medication, and that's where we're going to use the is not function. Now, we've got two options here. We could add it as a separate feature in this rule, or we could add it as a new rule. There are reasons for choosing one or the other. You'll hear different takes on different ones. I tend to use new rules when I'm looking for something fairly different, just because I find it easier to troubleshoot retrospectively. So I'm going to add a new rule. I'm going to still look for patients. Oh, I don't want tissues. I want courses, because I'm interested in what they have on repeat. I'm still going to use thyroxine here, and you'll see why in a second. So we're going to go for the drug. Ingredient levothyroxine. But we now are going to highlight that drug and exclude with our little button up here at the top. And you can see now what we're looking at is patients with a repeat medication. We're going to add a criteria quickly just to say that our repeat medication also has to be current. We're not interested. If they're on thyroxine now and they had citalopram 10 years ago, that doesn't affect us. So we're only looking at current repeat courses. But we're looking at patients on any current medication courses where the drug is not thyroxine. Just by using that little include exclude toggle on a criteria. Do the same with the courses. We could say only show me patients that have had things in the past, for example, but we only want current ones for this search. So my first rule, my first test, show me all the patients in my practice with levothyroxine on a current repeat. If they meet that criteria, they go to the next rule. If they don't meet that criteria, we exclude them, because for this purpose, we only want patients that are on levothyroxine. Our next rule then says, show me patients with medication courses where the drug is not thyroxine, i.e. anything else on current repeat. And that's the bit that takes some getting used to. The is not function, when we talk about medication course, when we talk about read codes, basically says, is anything else in that field? If we get topical for a moment, if we said, show me patients with vaccinations where the vaccination is not SARS coronavirus, then it would show us patients with every other vaccination, pneumococcal, flu, whatever, just excluding the coronavirus vaccination. But drug courses is probably the one that you're going to use this most frequently on when you're trying to show patients only on a particular drug with nothing else. Now this time I need to change my conditions on my rule. If my patient has another medication course of anything other than thyroxine, I want to exclude them from my final result. I want to kick them out basically because they've got other stuff on there. If a patient with levothyroxine on current repeat then fails this rule, i.e. does not have any other drugs, I want to include them. Save and run. It'll think about it for a couple of minutes. And we can see there we've got 3 patients who are only on current repeat levothyroxine with no other medication on their current repeat templates. Okay, this might be another example where we'd use an auto report if we wanted to see exactly what they had. So let's quickly run an auto report for that one. Let's view the results. So you can see there, this lady's just got the 50 microgram, this lady's got the 25, this chappie's got 125. You can see there, medication courses wise, name, dose and quantity, there's nothing else showing because they're on nothing except the repeat thyroxine. As I say, the is not function isn't something you're likely to use very often because you're basically saying, show me patients that have any other of this thing rather than the specified one. You know, show me patients with any repeat medication other than the one I've specified. Show me patients with any read code other than the ones I've specified. It's a fairly niche example, but electronic repeat dispensing is one of the ones that we've used it on quite a bit, where practices have said, okay, I need to find patients only on a particular drug without any other repeats because they tend to be quite stable on this one, and we can set them up for repeat dispensing first. Okay. So the next part we're going to have a look at is the scheduling of patient searches. So basically here, what we're going to look at is how we tell EMIS to run a search on a particular date and how we get it to run following a particular window. For example, we might want something to run every month on the 1st of the month. We might want something to run every April the 1st, show us patients from the last year. And for this one, let's pick on warfarin. It tends to be a fairly good bet for this. So we're going to do another patient search. We're going to look at warfarin. Last calendar month. Based on our current patient population again. This time, however, we're also going to add a schedule to our report. The scheduling basically comes in 3 parts. The first is the recurrence. This is how often it happens. I want this to recur monthly on the 1st of every 1 month. I.e., every month on the 1st of the month, this search is going to run. That's the date it's going to use. The range of recurrence. Now, this does throw people sometimes. Effectively, you can't set it indefinitely. You do have to put an end date on it, which is a bit of a pain. If I put 120 in there, for example, that's going to run for 10 years. I think it'll let you go up to, it's going to run, let's say, for about 60 times would be 30 years. So it will let you go quite a long way into the future. You'll play this a little bit by ear in practice. Some people will tend to set that to run for a year, and maybe on the 1st of April every year, they'll reset them all. Some people say, actually, I want it to run until I'm long retired, in which case they might say, and after 500, that's going to run for 500 months before it ends. You can see where we're going with this. I'm, for now, just going to tell it to run after 2 occurrences because I don't want it to keep going in our demo unit for months after we've finished this training. The baseline date is basically where we tell EMIS Web which day, effectively, the search is going to run on. So schedule execution date, basically that, it's going to run on the 1st of every month from the 1st of every month. And you'll see what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. We could change that. So we could say, for example, if we run it on the 15th, it runs as if it was the 1st. Typically speaking, we're not going to do that. So we're going to say instead, we want it to run on the 1st of every month, and we're going to use the baseline date as the run date. And then we build our search. Nothing particularly scary so far. So we're going to chuck a new rule on there, and we want patients with a medication issue, acute or repeat. And let's this time go for warfarin. Any variation thereof. Where the date is in the last calendar month. Now, how do we do that? We've just set our schedule to run on the 1st of every month. So we want our report basically to look back from the 1st of the month, back in time 1 month to the 1st of the previous month. So my date of issue, that they have to have had the warfarin after, get ready for some more terrible grammar, after 1 year of 1 month before the search date. And we can see there, at least it gives us a little bit of plain English below. If I run this on the 18th of February, it's going to look back to the 18th of January. But because of the way, if I go back up to the top here and look at my properties, because of the way we've scheduled it, every time it runs, it's going to run on the 1st of the month. So 1 month before the search date is going to be the 1st of the previous month. i.e., if I run this, if this runs on the 1st of March, which will be my first scheduled occurrence, it's going to look back to the 1st of February, 1 month before the search date. And the beauty of that is it's then going to sit there as run with its patient population showing when I come to it next. So if I come to that on the 6th of March, it's still going to have run on the 1st of March. So it's still going to have run the 1st of March back to the, 1st of March back to the 1st of February. So if I save and run this, this should show me patients that had an issue of warfarin. At the moment, it's going to show me patients that have had an issue of warfarin since the 18th of January because we've just saved and run. However, if I click run on my report and look at the advanced options, which we get whenever we run a report, we can tell EMIS Web the relative run date that we want to use, effectively the same as that scheduled report date that we've just looked at on the properties. Now, if I change this, before I do that, let's just have a look at our patients. Population includes, we've got 2 patients here. And like we've done previously, I'm just going to do a quick auto report to see what date they had that warfarin given. View results. And you can see there, we've got one from the 21st of January, which should come up on our January results. We've got one from the 18th of February. So Ronald there should disappear when we run our warfarin with a relative run date of the 1st of February, because it's going to look back to the 1st of January. It's not going to be looking at the rest of February. It's not going to see his issue on the 18th today. So now you can see that my warfarin has dropped to 1 and he's disappeared. It's only finding the lady that had it on the 21st of January because my relative, my baseline date effectively, my run date was the 1st of February and my search is set to look back 1 month into the past. And again, I'll use a quick auto report just to illustrate that one. See there, parent results have changed. So if I run my auto report on the 1st of February, bear in mind that we have to do that. I nearly forgot. We have to run those with a relative date in the same way that we do our parent reports, our patient searches. Well, that should only show us our lady that had it on the 21st of January. Now, as I say, the beauty of the scheduled report is that EMIS effectively does it for us. So if we set that to recur every month on the 1st of the month, and end after 2 in this case, but we could set that, you know, to hundreds into the future. If I come back to that in the middle of March, my report will have run on the 1st of March. So it'll be showing me my included population as if it was 1st of March back to the 1st of February. Okay. Hoping that's been fairly clear. I'm just going to revert back to our PowerPoint and we're just going to have a quick recap on the objectives. So we had a look at the count function first of all. We built a feature with a criteria, in this case of appointments, where the patient hadn't been marked as seen or finished. So we're assuming that they DNA'd. But then we added a count to say that we only wanted to see patients that met that criteria more than 3 times. And as you saw, we could then run an auto report to return either the dates that they DNA'd on, or if we tweaked our auto report, we could see the number of times that they were marked as having DNA'd, or marked as, you know, not having actually been seen. We had a play with the order, restrict, and check functions. So quite happy to revisit that one if anyone does have an example of something that they'd want to basically find people that had this. In fact, no, I've got one actually. We'll go back and we're going to have a look at patients who might be diabetic based on their last HbA1c score. So we've got an example there. We had a look at auto reports. We had a look at basically how we can use them to establish which piece of data has got a patient onto our report. We had a look at the linked features. So effectively saying, show me patients with this, without a later this, or with a later this. Show me patients, let's say for example, show me patients in hospital. We might find, you know, everyone with an emergency hospital admission without a subsequent code of discharge from hospital. We might find patients who are currently pregnant by looking for patients with the code patient currently pregnant without a subsequent any of the delivery codes, miscarriage codes, etc., etc. We looked at the is not function. So fairly niche one, but it allows us to see patients with any example of a particular piece of data except the one we've specified. For example, show me patients on any current repeat medication except for thyroxine. And then we had a look at the scheduling report. So we had a look at how we set a report's baseline date, how we tell it basically when to run, or which date to use for its relative start and end date. And we had a look at how we tell EMIS Web to run that for us on the schedule. So before we go to the questions, we're just going to do another quick order, restrict, and check function example. And the example for this one is going to be patients whose last HbA1c, I'm going to say above 40. There is an actual number, but I forget what it is off the top of my head. It's in the 40s somewhere. I'm sure somebody will pop up and tell me at some point. But we're going to look at patients whose last HbA1c was above 40. I'm going to do a new patient search. Our current population. Our rule is going to include the feature, clinical codes of, find it properly. Hemoglobin A1C level. I'm going to pick all of them because it's a demo unit. They'll be all over the place on our test patients. So I'm looking at any hemoglobin A1C level. My criteria, I'm going to order restrict or perform a check on that hemoglobin level to see if the value of the latest, I'm going to perform a check looking at the latest code, and we're going to check that the value is more than 40. So that's the code we're interested in, HbA1c level. The check is going to be that they're the latest one. And on the latest one, we only want to see if the value is more than 40. And if we save and run that, going to be 4 to 6 patients. And because we've done it so far successfully, we're going to run another auto report and just have a look at their last HbA1c recording. A few results. Tells us which code it is. That doesn't really help me too much. So instead, we want to edit our auto report. I'm going to lose the code term. And instead, I want to include the value because I know it's going to be a HbA1c code. But I want to see what that value was because I might be trying to target patients with higher value first. Now, when I view my results, instead of showing me a list of people that say HbA1c, we can see there. If we wanted to sort those, again, we can edit. We can drag the value column into our sorting window. And it's completely ignored me. It should be sorting my results. And it's the lowest. That's a little bit annoying. It's completely ignored me. It's continued to sort them by EMIS number. Instead, it's the two tables. That's why. So, what we need to do, to my mind, apologies guys, trying a complete mental block here. I'm sorting our table by value, descending, and factored in value, so it should start lowest to newest. Just for the sake of trying that, let's see what happens. Oh, it completely ignores me and continues to sort by the EMIS number. That's quite annoying. I can see if we can get it to sort by one of these instead. So let's try it based on what Tracy was asking us earlier around sorting by days. Let's see what happens if we tell it to sort our table by the patient's date of birth instead. There we go. It must be something to do with the fact that that's a separate table. As you can see there, we're sorting oldest to newest. So if we edit that, let's lose the EMIS number condition for now. And instead, let's sort let's try actually just putting in there. This might work a little bit better. There we go. It's because we've got two separate tables. Brain has kicked in eventually. So if we lose that table, and instead of having two separate ones, let's create one single table that also has the patient's EMIS number in this case in, just for illustrative purposes. Sorting by value, date that they had the code. And it still completely ignores me and sorts on EMIS number. Can't tell you, I'm afraid, why that's not behaving for me. It's part of the same table. It's typical that it does this when I've got an audience. Let's lose the patient details altogether. Let's just try sorting it by that one. And still, if it doesn't work this time, we can fairly conclusively say it seems to be broken. Yeah, definitely not playing nicely there. All over the place. Apologies, that's a terrible example. That should have behaved better than it did, because normally we can use that function on the auto report to sort our list. Have a look at our current smokers. So if we did our DNAs one, run our auto report quickly, we should then be able to edit that and say, order them by most to least. We can't order it with a count. Sorry, that's me promising things it won't do. Ignore me completely on that one. Apologies for that. That's a fairly terrible example to finish with. It didn't behave, and I can't actually tell you why, other than blaming it on the unit that I'm using. I suppose at this point, it's a good opportunity to open the floor to any questions based on what we've had a look at today, because we've looked at some fairly difficult concepts in there, especially when we talk about linking features and performing checks on the codes that we've added. Now, your question, Tracy, off the top of my head, I can't think of a way to tell EMIS which output to use. Let's test the theory. And you've seen there, they're not behaved brilliantly. Let's pick on our warfarin in last calendar month. Let's mess around with the auto report. Let's see if we can get the date of issue. To output as DDMMYY rather than having the abbreviated date. I've got a sneaky feeling it won't let me. we'll have a little look through. And while we do this, if anybody else has any questions or anything you'd like me to have a look at, any that you've tried to run maybe, or anything that you've tried to find that you've not been able to, or that you've hit a wall with, if you want to put them in the chat, we can actually have a look at those. Is there a clever way to get my medication issues to come out with date of issue? I think you're right in what you say, that it'll be doable in Excel. Let's have a quick go. So we're going to export it to Excel. Obviously, we've only got one result on here, so hopefully this should happen fairly quickly. Let's see how neat this is when we try and do it. So we'll put it on my desktop for now. Don't judge me for the messy desktop. There's quite a lot going on at the moment. And we should be able then to format this column to date. Might not like it actually, because of the way EMIS hyphenates it. I think the thing that's going to throw it is EMIS puts those in. If I lose those, it then does it. I think, Tracy, I might have to take that one away and have a play with that for you. I'm sure one of our EMIS wizards has found a way at some point, because you can't be the only person that would either prefer or in some cases need to have it in the EDMMYY format rather than the abbreviated short month. But because of the fact that EMIS hyphenates the date, I think that's going to confuse Excel. There's probably a way to tell it to account for that, but off the top of my head, I can't think of it. Let's hop back into EMIS for a second. That's all right, it's going to bug me now. You know what I'm like, I can't let things lie, so we sat till the wee hours playing in Excel and trying to make this work. There's got to be a way to tell Excel to factor that in, basically, because as far as I can see when you're building the auto reports, I've never come across a way to define the format of a criteria. Colette's asked us, I'd like to run a search for patients in an age group for the purpose of sending COVID vaccination invites and exclude those who've already had the vaccination. I knew someone was going to ask me that. Let's build one. So I'm going to be slightly kind to myself here. I'm not going to do cohort 6 and try and find everybody who's clinically vulnerable. Instead, we're going to pick on one of the earlier cohorts. Let's go for our patients 70 to 75, and we're going to exclude the ones that have had the vaccination. So we're going to do a new patient search. And the way I'm going to do this is on my current patient population. We could do a search for patients 70 to 75 and base our results on that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to do this as a linked option. So the first part of my search is going to be my patient population. Now, in this case, it's patient details. It's a nice, easy one. It's an age condition. older than 70, in this case, let's say younger than 75, on the day that I run the search. And in this case, what we'd want then is you'll hit this with most things. We could either add it as another feature, so we could say and exclude those that have had the vaccine. We could add it as a rule. You'll see different preferences on both. I'm going to add it as a separate rule, just because I find it a little bit easier to interpret here. In fact, because we've got a bit of time, we'll do it both ways just so you can see it. So we're going to look for patients with a clinical code. And the clinical code is going to be this is where I've got to remember how the vaccination is coded. I believe it's that one. Obviously, if we're doing this in the real world, we'd check a little bit more carefully the codes that we're including, but we'll be a bit cavalier for now. We'll just assume it's that one. And let's say, obviously at the minute we're in the first year, but just to illustrate, let's say that it's got to have happened after a year before the search date. It's got to have happened in the last year. Now, because I've done them as two separate rules, if they're 70 to 75, they go to the next rule. If they're not 70 to 75, they're automatically excluded. If, in this case, my rule is set to include those who've had the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine added in the last year. So if I'm doing them as rules, I'd have to use my toggle here to say exclude them if they've had it and include them if they haven't had it. Alternatively, let's just delete that rule. We could use the feature option. Same thing, still looking at a feature of a clinical code being we'll chuck a couple in, obviously, like I say, we'd check which one EMIS is coding the mouse before we did it in the real world, but we're not in the real world for this. We could highlight our feature and toggle up here. So you can see there it's changed. This is our is not function again. So we'd say exclude patients with the clinical code for the vaccine. So for this, our rule is an AND rule. They must be 70 to 75, and they must not have had the COVID vaccine, because it's going to exclude them. Now, we alluded a couple of seconds ago to our clinically vulnerable code, I should say, cohort 6. Let's do that, and we're not going to do it comprehensively, simply put because I can't remember all the criteria off the top of my head. We'll just save and close this one for now. And let's just have a look what that might look like, or might start to look like. Patient search, so cohort 6. And this one, we might actually add several different features. So clinical code, let's pick some that I know are on there off the top of my head. Let's include our diabetics. Diabetes mellitus, and all of its children for now. Or we might want patients with the clinical codes for dementia. Now you see this at the moment, and it's actually quite a good question. At the moment, it's saying they must have diabetes and dementia, because they're part of the same rule. As you can see here up at the top, we've got a fairly easy little toggle. We're now saying they must have either dementia or diabetes, or let's go for, we'll go fairly broad on this one. I know it's not strictly accurate. Let's say leukemia. Let's hop up to the top of the tree with that one and get all of the leukemia codes. And you can see now, instead of it being an and condition, they must have diabetes and dementia and leukemia. You can toggle it to an or. And then after that, we could say, okay, and include the feature. Now this is where using a separate rule actually becomes quite useful. Because if I include the feature, as we did previously, clinical codes, I need to put the vaccine bit on. We're excluding them. As you can see there, because this rule is an or rule, everything in it becomes an or. So it's saying patients with diabetes, dementia, leukemia, all those that have not had the vaccine. It doesn't really help us very much. So this is an example of where we want to use a separate rule. Rule 1 is an or rule, i.e. our at-risk cohorts. Rule 2 becomes then our clinical code. I want to getting trigger happy there, apologies. We want to include we don't want to see patients that have had the vaccine already. We want to exclude. So now our search looks for patients with diabetes or dementia or leukemia. If they've got them, we try the next rule, exclude patients with the SARS-CoV vaccination. So if they've got this on their record, they're excluded. They'll show in the final result. If they haven't got this on their record, they're included. Does that help? Is there anything else around that you'd like me to sort of have a look at? And as Laura says, EMIS have published the actual cohort searches. They're not showing actually on my unit because it's a fairly out-of-date demo unit, but they have actually published your cohort reports. That's a pleasure. Like I say, it's a fairly strange concept actually. It's one of those where depending on how many criteria you're putting into your first rule will determine whether or not you can use the same rule to exclude bits, or whether you have to have a separate rule to exclude. And you can see there, when we make a rule an or rule, if we then want to exclude, or if our exclusion is based on an or, we want to include something, we have to add that as a separate rule. Okay, does anyone else have any other examples they'd like me to have a look at, or just would anyone like me to sort of cover any of the areas that we've been over today? Again, I'll just pop the objectives bit up. Again, just to sort of refresh the memory a little bit. We have covered quite a lot of ground in a fairly short space of time, and it seems like as good an opportunity as any for me to mention the fact that this doesn't have to be the only help that you have with this. So if you like something that you've seen today, but you think, okay, I'd like to look at that in a little bit more detail, then give us a call through the NECS help desk. Say you'd like to book an EMIS reporting session. We can actually go into it in a bit of detail with you. We can look at a couple of specific examples with you if you'd like to as well. The clear function instead of delete, okay, that's one. So we're talking this one here, aren't we? clear basically wipes the slate completely clean like that. So delete will delete the bit that you've got highlighted. If I just chuck back in, let's just chuck a quick medication one on there. So there's a rule. Let's chuck another rule on in this case. Medical codes. Let's chuck in INR. So delete basically will let me delete the bit that I've highlighted. If I wanted to just delete the INR bit, I could do that. Delete the selected rule. If I'm editing a rule and I hit delete, it's just going to remove the bit that highlights. So in this case, it would just remove that one criteria. If I delete that, it's going to delete the whole feature. Whereas if I use clear, it's basically wipe the slate clean. So if I've got a fairly complex search, clear is going to take me back down to bare metal, as it were. Yes, it's quite a nice piece of advice, actually. For the sake of a couple of extra clicks, I would probably delete rule by rule or feature by feature. Clear, to be honest, unless you spent a lot of time setting up the scheduling bit, as we did on the properties tab, actually clear probably isn't much better than deleting the entire search and starting again. So yeah, really good piece of advice that, actually, Michelle. Use with extreme caution. Pop this one back up for a second, just to see if anyone's got any other bits that they'd like to have a look at just in our last few minutes today. Like I say, I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. By all means, do ask. If you get stuck with something, if it's a quick question, you know, how would I get this? Fire it through the help desk, one of us can remote on and have a look with you. If it's a bit more of a, I think I get it, but I'd like to sit with somebody for an hour or two and actually, well, remotely at the moment, but I'd like to sit with somebody for an hour or two and actually kind of play through a few examples of these, really understand how the functionality works, we can do that as well. We'll book that in with you. It's something I do want to stress to everyone. It is fairly heavy functionality. There's a reason that a lot of people shy away from reporting or shy away from being, in inverted commas, too clever with it, because it's quite daunting when you start out. But do shout up if you do want to look at it in more detail, or if you find yourself struggling. And Michelle's just asked a perfect question there. If we do need you at all, what's the best way to book in? At the moment, certainly, the best way for you to get hold of us is via the NECS help desk. As Vicky said, I'm quite happy for you guys to try emailing me, but at the moment, getting hold of me is quite frankly a nightmare. So if you ring through the help desk, basically what we do is we have a trainer kind of assigned to that every day. So if you're, let's say, for example, cohort 5 drops, you're running your reports and something's turning around that's not quite right, rather than emailing me and potentially not getting an answer for a week or so, if you go through the help desk, one of us should be on with you within a day or so.
Well, thanks ever so much, Ross, again, and thanks everyone for attending. That's great.
Yeah, thanks guys, thanks for joining us. I hope it's been useful, and thanks for giving, as much as anything, thanks for giving me an excuse to play with EMIS again, because as you all know in Derbyshire, you're a bit of a minority, so it's nice to be able to, dust the cobwebs off every now and then. And like I say, just because you're on EMIS and you're a minority in Derbyshire, don't think that you've forgotten. If you need help on something, if you need training on something, you can still access it exactly the same way.